Rolex or Tudor? It's complicated. Hey, it's Alt from Alta Gear, and today's glint on the wrist is the Seiko SARB 017 Alpinist. Whenever I do activities that are somewhat more strenuous or playing with the kids at all, I do wear my Seikos because I don't want to beat up more expensive watches. I know some people out there have no problem with demolishing their watches just to prove that they're tool watches, but that's not me. I do like my watches to look somewhat well preserved and not dinged all to hell after a couple of months of wear. So Seiko Alpinist for today's activities with the family. Anyway, on to the purpose of this video, which is the conversation of Tudor versus Rolex and how those two have this history of coexistence and synergy that maybe some people in today's market don't appreciate. They just want to give all of the claim to fame to Rolex and disregard Tudor as a poor man's watch. But there's actually a very complicated history between the two watches. And for the purposes of this video, I want to discuss something that was brought to my attention via the comments, where someone had posted and asked me how my Tudor Prince Day date compared in terms of size to my Rolex Datejust, which I have sold off. And they're both 36 millimeter watches. They share very similar characteristics, and I will reply to that comment with more specifics later. But it did get my brain thinking about what's happening with Rolex and Tudor currently in today's market and how it impacts the mindset of collectors and people who want to buy watches for whatever reason. Maybe you want a good collection for just wear and your own self-gratification. Maybe you want to wear these watches to impress people on the internet, whatever. You know, I don't judge. And we have to look back to the beginning of Rolex and the beginning of Tudor and how those two brands came about and really what has differentiated between them in this modern era versus previous times when the watches actually had a lot more similar than you might think. So what I can't do is pretend that I know everything off the top of my head. I don't. I have to reference other resources because this particular topic of dates and horology don't really interest me all that much. So I'm going to reference the trusty iPad to talk a little bit about both brands and the origins that date back to the founders of both companies, which is Hans Wilsdorf. And for those that didn't know, Hans Wilsdorf actually founded his first watch company in 1905. Now, that's obviously very old. We're talking over 100 years at this point. But compared to the likes of Patek and Omega and Vacheron, those brands are significantly older than Rolex. I mean, Rolex, you could almost regard it as the Apple of the watch industry. They came out with some really innovative brands and new marketing techniques and new strategies that were not employed by other watchmakers at the time. So consider Rolex the revolutionary startup brand. Hans Wilsdorf, in many ways, was the Steve Jobs of that era as it pertains to watches, because watches at the time were rather dainty things, not so sports oriented. Water resistance was largely non-existent. And Hans Wilsdorf really wanted to make a watch that was utilized new technologies and design philosophies and could take the levels of abuse that a traditional, more dress style watch could not. All right. Anyway, that said, so he registered the name Rolex in 1908. Now, Tudor was actually not founded for almost 40 years later, and that was in 1946. And the name Tudor comes about because apparently, and I can't vouch for this because I haven't researched it enough because it's not that important to me, but apparently Hans Wilsdorf was a bit of an Anglophile. And the Tudor name was chosen as somewhat of a honoring of the Tudor Dynasty of England, which obviously was highly influential on the world in terms of the Reformation and Queen Elizabeth. So there's a lot of history there. If you have never had an interest in the aristocracy of the UK, the Tudor Dynasty specifically is a lot more interesting of a topic because many of the things that took place under the Tudor Dynasty paved the way for elements of what happened in the New World here in the USA. Well, really in Australia too. I mean, there was a whole segment of thinking that moved away from the traditions of the Catholic Church that came about through King Henry VIII. Anyway, that's a whole other story. I myself am a big fan of the history related to the Tudor Dynasty. Love the TV show. If you've never watched it, it's actually really, really good. It's something I think everyone should watch, or at the very least, some highly fictionalized version of history, but really entertaining. Anyway. And so for about Tudor, Hans Wilsdorf said the following. For some years now, I have been considering the idea of making a watch that our agents could sell at a more modest price than our Rolex watches, and yet one that could attain the standards of dependability for which Rolex is famous. I decided to form a separate company with the object of making and marketing this new watch. It is called the Tudor Watch Company. Now, this is pretty important because Tudor was not made specifically to be a complete deviation from Rolex. Not at all. I mean, one of the claims to fame for Tudor watches in the old days, they were largely identical in terms of technology. For example, the Oyster case was featured in many Tudor and Rolex watches in the beginning to almost an identical extent. The main difference being the Tudors use ETA movements and the Rolex used in-house manufactured movements. Or sometimes Rolex had interesting business relationships with movement makers specifically for Rolex. So for the sake of this conversation, let's call Rolex at the time in-house movements, and let's call Tudor movements ETA movements. And that was it. That was completely it. I mean, there was nothing dramatically stepped down from Rolex to Tudor other than the movement. Now, this is important in terms of timing. So if you think about that era, the accuracy of the watch was pretty critical, more so than it is now, because we are in fact surrounded by timekeeping devices in our cars, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, like here. We are inundated with depictions of time. And so the absolute critical accuracy of a movement is not as important to us today, because if you're late because of your watch being off, 10 seconds a day, you're an idiot. That's your own fault. It's got nothing to do with the watch. You're just a moron because time is everywhere. And so the excuse was, well, my watch is actually an ETA and it's not cost certified, therefore I was late. Yeah, you're a moron. That's a terrible thing to say, a terrible excuse. But if we go back to some of the early Rolexes and early Tudors, if we look at something like the Submariner, and I don't know all the model numbers off the top of my head. I think the model I'm specifically thinking was the 6204 Submariner. Don't quote me on that. I'm likely wrong. And for the Tudor, it was the 7922. Now, those watches by Tudor and Rolex for the Submariner were actually designed concurrently. And they shipped very close together, I believe, within the same year. And the primary difference, again, was that ETA movement, but both featured Oyster cases. But here's a picture of the first Submariner, and here's a picture of the first or near first Tudor. And what do they both look like? Strangely enough, they look very similar to a watch sold today in the form of the Tudor Black Bay. So this is what gets interesting about when people talk about Tudor versus Rolex, and I'll talk about my own specific experience here in a minute. The DNA of both watches is actually pretty close. We have the same ancestor. I mean, for those of you who are biblically inclined and believe in a higher power, consider Hans Wilsdorf the Adam, and we are the offshoot of Adam and Eve. It's not that far removed. And for people to say, well, Tudor is so far below Rolex, I would say no, not at all. I mean, if anything, Tudor is actually living the original mission of Hans Wilsdorf. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the Black Bay watches, if you look at the toolish oriented design features and the simplicity, that really has always been the history of Tudor. Now, there's a whole period in the 2000s and 90s where Tudor was doing just crazy stuff with things like the Aquanaut. And those watches, while collectible in some ways, were somewhat hideous. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I'll give you that. But Tudor is still very much what was intended from long ago. Now, what does that mean for today? And I'll give you my own anecdotal experience with owning a Rolex and owning a Tudor. And so in this case, I'm talking specifically about the Datejust 36 millimeter, which actually was my first Rolex. And I currently don't have a Rolex. I sold that watch with the intention, and I won't get into it because if my wife watches this video, she'll kill me. But, and then I have the Tudor Prince date, the 76213, I believe is the reference number. And I will tell you, in my own experience, owning both watches, having the Rolex on the wrist, having the Tudor on the wrist, Freudian slip. I will say honestly, the Tudor gives me more gratification when I wear it because aesthetically, it's more of what I wanted out of that type of watch. I wanted a watch that was a throwback to the 80s, which I remember very fondly because I grew up in that era and I'm a New Yorker natively. So Wall Street, Glengarry, Glen Ross type mindset, shakers and movers, American Psycho. And I really wanted a watch that lived really aesthetically in that era. That's what appealed to me. The modern Datejust 36, fantastic watch. Nothing wrong with it. Definitely had some benefits over the Prince Day-Date, which is, for example, the Lume. The Lume and the Clasp are both better. But what I get with the Tudor is more of a vintage-inspired watch without the vintage garbage. And what I mean is like worn out movements or beat to hell dials and bracelets that are rusted over and dinged and scratched. I didn't want to deal with that. I wanted all of the perks of the vintage aesthetic without all the drama of purchasing a vintage watch from whomever. So when you go shopping for a watch and you are looking at Tudor and Rolex and you're making that consideration and comparisons, I'm going to give you fair warning. And that warning is when you fork out that $10,000 for the Rolex versus the $4,000 or $3,000 for the Tudor, do keep in mind it's highly possible you will not get as much gratification out of the Rolex as you suspect in your skull. And this is why you need to investigate as many brands as possible and get those watches on the wrist and find what works for you. Do not let anyone on the internet, whether it be on a forum or a YouTube guru, decide which watch is right for you. Because speaking for myself, the 36 millimeter Datejust is truly a classic, but the 36 millimeter Tudor Prince Day-Date makes me happier. It was certainly cheaper. I can afford both watches clearly because I had both. They were in my collection. It's not a money issue. It's just an issue of what gives me more warm and fuzzies. And when you are comparing those two brands, just think of them as one's a big brother, one's a little brother. One has a really awesome soccer kick. One has a really awesome pitching arm. But one is not better than the other. They just appeal to different types of mindsets. But you have to know what that mindset is before you buy the watch, because what you put on your wrist has to make you happy, or you're going to be one of those people constantly flipping, and that gets expensive, it gets time consuming, and it actually drains brain power you could be using to better yourself in other ways, whether it be career or education or academics, whatever it is. So in a nutshell, Tudor versus Rolex, it is a complicated thing. Don't think one is inherently better than the other. It's absolutely not true, especially not today, because Tudor's watches feature in-house movements, which are really phenomenal. They have anti-magnetic properties. They're highly accurate. That whole reason you would move away from Tudor, because it has ETA movement versus a in-house Rolex movement, is gone in Rolex watches. Tudor watches like the Black Bay, for example. And the Black Bay GMT features a recently designed in-house Tudor movement. So even though my Tudor has an ETA movement, the accuracy, whatever differences they may be, I haven't had an issue, and I usually don't wear a watch more than one day at a time anyway. It's fine. So thank you for watching the video. I appreciate it. We are almost up to 100 subscribers. And if you're curious as to why I make videos on YouTube now, it's mostly for conversation. I don't do it for money. I do it to engage other people who like wristwatches, and that's it. Forums have their own issues, where forums, though, you end up with a lot of moronic opinions that don't mean anything to me. Here on YouTube, it allows me to have a level of discourse which is a little bit higher than found on places, like Rolex forum. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Alt from Alt to Gear. Till next time.